Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My co-host this week, as always, is Cleveland area attorney and sometime Republican strategist Jay Carson. Before we get to the show, I wanted to let you know that we're recording and releasing this episode of the Politics Guys a day early on Saturday instead of Sunday. The reason why is that I'll be at Northern Kentucky University's commencement ceremonies all day on Sunday, which I can't really skip since, as the NKU Faculty Senate President, I'm also Grand Marshal at commencement. It makes for a long day, but seeing all those students walk across the stage and receive their diplomas is pretty great. Plus, I've got just about the best view in the house since I'm the guy who hands the diploma to the president, who then gives them to the students. And so here we are, a day early. And now, on to the show. Our top story today is the House of Representatives passing the American Health Care Act by a razor-thin 217 to 213 margin. Now, the vote, which was pushed through before the Congressional Budget Office could evaluate the effects of the legislation, will now head to the Senate, where it seems almost certain that there are going to be significant changes. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has indicated he's committed to getting an Obamacare replace and repeal bill through his chamber, so we're likely to see something, though it could take up to a few months. Now, at that point, what's almost certain to be a far less radical Senate bill will have to be reconciled with the House bill in a joint House-Senate Conference Committee, with the compromise language having to be approved by majorities in both the House and the Senate before heading to President Trump's desk. In other words, that Rose Garden celebration ceremony President Trump held with the House Republican leadership this week, that might prove to be just about as premature as President Bush's famous mission accomplished speech. Would you agree, Jay?
Well, I'd say, look, sometimes you celebrate the first touchdown, even though maybe you haven't won the game yet. I think it was perhaps premature. But again, keep in mind that what they were looking at was the idea of there being a health repeal and replace bill versus none whatsoever. Had the House not been able to do that, I think it would have been a big problem for Trump and for a lot of Republicans who campaigned on this. So I get the exuberance. I should also mention, although you and I don't really always keep score, I believe I made a prediction couple months back that the House would actually pass something.
That sounds vaguely familiar.
Am I correct?
That does sound
okay.
familiar.
I'm just saying, not that we keep score, but
let's score one for Jay.
They
okay.
get it done, and I'm willing to put down a marker now that the Senate will get legislation passed also.
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you there, though I would be stunned if the Senate legislation wasn't very different from what we saw from the House.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, there are going to be changes, I think. So, but why don't we? You want to tell the people what's in the bill?
Well, I think before we even get to that, I want to kind of pull way back just for a minute to give people a sense of what health insurance even looks like in the United States. This won't be too long, but I think it's really important to bring in this context because basically there are 5 places people get health insurance in the United States. By far, the leading place is through their employers. That's around half or so, 49%, the last figures I saw. Then there's Medicaid at around 20%, Medicare at around 14%.
Medicare.
Yeah, Medicare at around 14%. The individual market at around 7%. There are some various other smaller public insurance programs around 2%, and then the uninsured, and that's around 9%. So now this is a pretty screwy system by the standards of the rest of the developed world, other rich countries. No one really does it in quite this weird way we do it. There are a lot of reasons behind that we won't get into, but it's very different, certainly. Now, before we get into the American Health Care Act, we need to understand a little bit about what Obamacare was designed to do. And really, Obamacare only focused on two parts of those five places people get their health insurance, and that's Medicaid and the individual market. So the vast majority really wasn't affected a ton by Obamacare, right? And so Obamacare worked to expand Medicaid. In fact, around 14 million more people in the 31 states that opted into expansion did end up signing up on Medicaid. And it also required...
and actually the vast majority of people who gained insurance under Obamacare came through the Medicaid expansion rather than through the individual exchange markets.
Yeah, and that's a very important point. It also required uninsured people to buy insurance, the famous individual mandate, but it gave them income-based subsidies to do so. In addition, it required that insurers use what's called community rating, meaning that insurers can't charge people more based on their health status. It didn't allow insurers to decline coverage to people due to pre-existing conditions, and it also required that all plans cover what are called essential health benefits, things like prenatal treatment, mental health, lab work, and various other things. And as a result, millions more people were covered, but there are some concerns about the long-term viability of Obamacare, especially among conservatives. Would you say that's a fair sort of summary of what Obamacare tried to do?
I think so. I think that's a fair summary. I would only add to that by saying a lot of the things that were in Obamacare, when we talk about things like community rating and guaranteed issue, which are sort of important concepts to get. For how insurance markets work, and we can talk about that later. A lot of that was already provided for by pre-existing federal rules or state laws governing insurance companies. So as you say, again, a lot of the folks who got their insurance through their employer did not see a tremendous change with Obamacare. One thing that they did see, though, was rising premiums across the board that I think were related to some of the things that Obamacare did. But we can get onto that later. So.
Okay. Now, before we get to that, we want to welcome a new sponsor to the show, Pro Flowers. Mother's Day is coming up. May 14th is going to be here before you know it. And a great way to show your appreciation for all Mom has done is with a beautiful bouquet from Pro Flowers. And I got a bouquet from Pro Flowers just a few days ago, in fact, and it made my morning. Nobody's mom, but it was a nice thing to get. I took a picture. Well, actually, my wife did because she's a much better photographer than I am, and I'm going to post it to the Facebook page and the Twitter feed so you can see how great they look. Now, Jay, you got some flowers too, didn't you?
I did. I did, and I like seamlessly pretended that I had ordered those for my wife all along.
Oh, slick.
And that I got them for just because. So no, they're lovely, and it arrives in a vase with a flower. Plant food that you add to it, and they arrive sort of just pre-bloomed condition, so you enjoy them for the entire length of their lifespan. Yes, bloomage.
Yes, yeah, they are really nice. And when you send the 100 Blooms for Mom bouquet from Pro Flowers this Mother's Day, you will make a real impression because it comes with that free glass vase, which Jay mentioned, for just $19.99 plus shipping and handling. And if you really want to make a statement, you can upgrade to a premium vase and include gourmet chocolates for just $10 more. Choose the delivery date you want, and Pro Flowers are guaranteed to arrive fresh and beautiful and stay that way for at least 7 days or your money back. Now, the only way to get 100 Blooms for Mom with a free glass vase starting at $19.99 is to visit proflowers.com. Click on the microphone in the top right corner and use our code TPG. That's proflowers.com and code TPG when you click on the mic. This stunning bouquet sells out fast, so order today. Okay, back to the American Health Care Act. So here's my impression of what the American Health Care Act does, and you can jump in, correct me where you think I'm getting it wrong. But number one, it slowly unwinds the Obamacare Medicaid expansion. Secondly, it undoes the insurance mandate, but it still has sort of a mechanism to get people to buy coverage by penalizing people who have gaps in coverage, because the legislation allows insurers to charge them more, a first-year 30% surcharge. Now, it keeps subsidies, but these subsidies are lower than under Obamacare, and they're, bizarrely, as far as I'm concerned, linked not to income, but to age. Now, it keeps the pre-existing conditions prohibition, but it essentially eviscerates it by allowing states to opt out of it with waivers, which allows people with gaps in coverage to be charged based on health status and not by community rating. Now, the tricky thing here is this in turn is likely to make the community rating rate higher, because the healthiest people in waiver states will want to be charged based on their health status, because it's going to be lower than the community rating. So they'll drop out, making the community rating group sicker and sicker, with the premiums going up higher and higher as a result. So there's that. And then it does, though, require waiver states to set up high-risk pools for the sickest people who can't afford insurance, though healthcare analysts say that the legislation doesn't come close to funding the cost of these pools. Now, my take on all this is a rushed, cobbled-together mess of a bill that's going to make millions more people uninsured or underinsured. Now, it will lower premiums in the long run, I have no doubt, but only by forcing millions of people out of the market entirely. So that's my take. Jay, what do you think?
So, yeah, I agree with you on, look, that's what's in the bill. I would disagree maybe with your analysis about what's going to happen. And I think we got to take a look and remember this is affecting really a minority of the people who receive healthcare either through the individual marketplace or who were added to the rolls through the Medicaid expansion. But what it does that's important is it stops the increases that we're being seen in premiums for everyone else. That was really something that's troubling and affects the entire system. Was when these you would have mandates of additional coverages, less flexibility, and we'll talk about the guaranteed issue stuff in just a second. But what that did was it was causing rises in price across the board, and eventually it would become unsustainable. This, I think, and a lot of Republicans object to it because it still keeps the sort of fundamental architecture of Obamacare, but it is a more sustainable piece. The other big piece of this is the changes to Medicaid, in that states will now have a lot more flexibility as to how to run their own Medicaid systems, which could and likely will result in some significant cost savings. This also repeals a lot of taxes that went along with the Obamacare plan to fund it. For example, taxes on various health plans, the Cadillac tax, so to speak, that were used to raise the money for this that now isn't necessarily needed. So, I think maybe I guess where I'd like to start is let's get a picture of how healthcare insurance works, because it's different than other types of insurance, and that goes to the idea of what's called community rating and guaranteed issue.
Before we get into that, Jay, though, I wanted to take issue with a couple of points you made. Number one, I mean, you're right, of course, that the AHCA only affects the minority of the market, but we're talking about tens of millions of people. So this is not an insubstantial number of people. There are going to be millions and millions of people who are going to lose coverage if this bill were to become law, and that's a very significant thing, even though numerically they may be a minority. Second, I also want to point out that while a number of conservatives have argued that Obamacare was in a death spiral, there are plenty of health economists who say that wasn't the case at all. And while there were some first, second, and third year adjustments that insurers had to make because they made some miscalculations about who would sign up and who wouldn't, these things could have been easily taken care of with tweaks to the program. And in fact, that even absent tweaks, that the premium levels were leveling out and so forth, and it wasn't the disaster, the spiraling down the drain thing that a lot of conservatives made it out to be. So these are
the adjustments will keep increasing premiums.
Well, but no, that's my point. It looked like that was going to level out. There were a number of health economists who felt that would definitely be the case, but that wasn't given a chance to happen because a number of the irresponsible things that the Trump administration did essentially caused health insurers to become a lot more skeptical, a lot more squeamish, skittish, understandably so. So I'm just saying that I'm not saying that certainly a lot of people don't agree with your take on it, but it is a disputed take, and there are a number of experts who would say that just wasn't the case at all.
Yeah, fair enough. But I also point out there were a whole lot of health economists who predicted at the time that this would not increase premiums. And in fact, it was dubbed the Affordable Care Act because it was supposed to decrease premiums and make healthcare more affordable across the board.
Sure.
But beyond that, there's been so much I've seen on social media and from the House floor, making these claims about pre-existing conditions and people with pre-existing conditions being thrown off of the rolls and so forth. And I want to talk a little bit about that because you mentioned that people would lose insurance, and that is true to the extent people who were in the individual market and now are no longer required to buy policies. I think that number was estimated to be at I want to say 12 million. Don't quote me on that. But it may be people who weren't in the market because they didn't want to be in the market. There were also a large number of folks who, even when given the opportunity in Medicaid expansion states, had the opportunity to sign up for Medicaid, but just chose not to. Now, I'm not saying they chose not to just because they didn't want it or that's anti-government or they thought they could get better deal somewhere else. But I'm just saying that more to impress it's not simply that people are trying to get this coverage and then are being thrown off by the big mean insurance companies. These are people who didn't have coverage before because they didn't want to have coverage or for whatever reason.
Some.
And now they are, it's what I'm saying is people who have insurance now, they are not going to be thrown off of their policies or canceled because of pre-existing conditions, as the left has been trumpeting.
Well, yeah, and I think certainly there has been some exaggeration to this. I agree with you on that. But if you take a look at the setup of at least the House plan, and again, I think the final legislation is going to be very different. When the CBO did its analysis of the previous bill, which is fairly similar, the one they never voted on, they concluded there'd be millions of people who would be left uninsured who are currently uninsured. So, the fact of the matter is all solid, reputable, independent analysis say that President Trump is lying when he says that nobody will lose coverage. There will be millions of people who won't have coverage. In part, you talked about that Medicaid, Medicaid part of it, and you're right that states are going to get more flexibility, but also they're going to get a ton less funding. There are huge cuts to the Medicaid portion of it, and states aren't going to be able to make up those gaps, and people are going to lose coverage. And so this is a really, really awful thing for millions of Americans, and I'm not going to make light of that, and you're not either. I'm just saying,
Well, no. Keep in mind. Also, though, with the Medicaid expansion, even those Medicaid expansion states, there was, the way it started out was initially there would be pots of additional federal money coming to those states. That money was going to decrease over time under Obamacare, and the states would be responsible for making up the difference. So again, to me, that's one of those things of look, we're going to be in that position regardless. But again, going back to just how healthcare works, because I think that this is important. The idea is that with life insurance or auto insurance, it is experience rated, meaning they take the company takes a look at you and underwrites you based on your specific risks. How good of a driver are you? How many tickets have you had? They look at your demographics, your age. They can look at your health status, lifestyle, all these things, and come up with a number that says this adequately reflects our risk to pay on the policy that we're selling you. Health insurance is different because it has this community rating system, which essentially says, as you pointed out, you're not going to be charged extra because of your health condition, age, so forth. There are lifestyle factors that can be factored in. There are some other just general economic factors, that go to where you live, what's the cost of living, and so forth. But they can't charge insured A more than insured B because the one person has a pre-existing condition. And again, that's been the law in most places for decades now, and that's how we've operated, because that's sort of the right way to do it. You're not discriminating against those who sort of draw the short genetic straw and end up with getting some sort of.
I disagree with you on that. I believe that that's not the case. In fact, and that's why the Obamacare pre-existing condition thing was pretty important. In the individual market, people could be denied based on pre-existing conditions. Now, in the employer-based market, that typically isn't a thing, and you just sign up as part of your group. But that was one of the great things that Obamacare did.
Well, the other piece of that was, though, continuous coverage.
Mm-hmm.
In that if you were continuously covered, had insurance before and then signed up, you could not be turned down for pre-existing conditions. And that again goes to the idea of community rating, because your risk is already kind of baked in, if you will, if you are insured, and it eliminates the free rider sort of moral hazard problem that you get when if you could simply not sign up for insurance whatsoever, and then when you do get some dreadful disease, go and get insured for it. It's an impossible way for insurance companies to run. No one would buy insurance. But if you buy early, they calculate in that rate the community rating piece, and say you are if the likelihood of you getting cancer is 2% within the next year or something, based on the community rating, that's sort of the price that's factored in, as opposed to if you're uninsured and then you develop cancer, then you apply, at that point your likelihood is 100%. So I think that continuation of coverage is something that's important, that is so often left out by the Democrats. I mean, always if you switch jobs or you move from one insured situation to another, you're not going to be denied for pre-existing conditions. And again, that's been pretty standard for several decades. Well, you're right. I mean, if you're just coming from uninsured to just buy on the individual market, to the extent one used to exist, right, you could be denied, because in that case you would be based on individual experience rating rather than community rating.
Yeah, well, and, let's just be clear here on the whole pre-existing condition thing. In technically, Republicans who say that the prohibition is still in place, they're right, And so, in a way, you can say that Donald Trump made 3 promises, I should say, about the American Health Care Act. Number 1, nobody will lose coverage. That is certainly false. Number 2, they will take care of people with pre-existing conditions. Well, depending on what you mean by take care of.
I'll disagree with you on that, because
you don't think anyone will lose coverage. Billions taken away
they're
from.
no longer forced to acquire it.
No, Jay. Billions taken away from Medicare, and you don't think anyone's going to lose coverage? That all the states are going to make up for all those gaps? You really completely want to throw out the CBO analysis. Now, again, we don't have one for this latest one. But
let's define our terms. When you say lose coverage, are you going to say your policy, your benefits might not be identical to what they were before, or you might have higher copays, higher deductibles?
No, I'm saying.
I mean, is that what you mean by lose coverage?
Well, you can say
you are now uninsured.
You can say in part, now, I guess it depends on how you define it, you're right, but let's say your deductible all of a sudden, or your copay, or sorry, your premiums go up all of a sudden by, 75%, and you just, while you technically you can buy coverage, that still essentially means that you've lost your coverage, you've been priced out of the market. So that I would count as losing coverage, just because, I technically could buy a Ferrari, but in reality, I can't because, we need to make house payments and things like that and so forth. So I'm priced out of that market, just like millions of people will be priced out of insurance markets.
All right. You know what? We'll agree to disagree on that. Based on the numbers.
Okay. Well, I will stick with the CBO.
But keep in mind also, under the Obamacare system, where you had premium increases going up, in the 40s, 50% in a lot of places every year. Everyone would have eventually been priced.
No, that's disputable.
My deductible plan at work went from, more than doubled in the last 3-4 years. So it's there are market factors, but it's not a thing of, you're simply being thrown off of your insurance, or your insurance company can cancel you. And it's addressing the problem, because it's going to bring down premiums that wouldn't have been brought down before, because otherwise everybody would be in the same boat with the continuing increasing premiums.
But it's going to bring down premiums by pushing a lot of people out of the market. That's how those premiums are coming down, not because you're going to get innovation and wonderfulness and so forth.
No. They're coming down because they're not going to have as many strictures and regulations, and the companies are going to be able to come up with different plans, different policies that they can offer to different markets.
That's going to have a minuscule effect. The real reason that premiums are going to come down, and this is exactly what was in the initial CBO analysis, is that the main reason premiums are going to come down is because all the people who would have to pay a ridiculous amount for their health care insurance will be priced out of the market. That's what the CBO says, and that's what I believe is exactly what's going to happen. So,
but then you get into the issue of, you've got the high risk pools, which are going to be created,
the underfunded high risk pools,
and subsidized, and many states had high risk pools before Obamacare. Obamacare eliminated the state's ability to do that, and states were able to subsidize that. There will be an additional $8 billion federal subsidy.
Not nearly enough
for these high risk pools. Now, you can make the argument $8 billion isn't enough, but those states that had high risk pools and have gotten waivers to it, Alaska is one example. If you looked at the premium increases that they had experienced the past couple of years, and then they received a waiver, were able to do a high risk pool, the premium increase in the last year was something like 7%, down from, again, like the 40%. So that's the way you expand coverage for those folks.
No, I think there's something to what you say. I believe that certainly under Obamacare, that Democrats focused too much on coverage and not enough on cost. And I think that was a big flaw, my main problem with Obamacare. But under the American Health Care Act, they're going the exact opposite way. And in a sense, it makes sense to me because it's a reaction to that, and so I think Republicans are focusing way too much on bringing premiums down and not enough on who's going to lose coverage under this. And though I have some faith, some hope that the Senate will reverse some of the what I see as the largest idiocies in the House bill, and I think what emerges will still be bad for millions of Americans, but will be much less bad than what the House bill is.
Okay, with that, that's sort of a ringing endorsement.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be awful, but less awful. So, all right, well, let's move on to our other really big story this week. One that's now been, largely overshadowed by that House healthcare vote. This is the bipartisan, and yes, you heard me right, bipartisan agreement in Congress on the spending bill that avoids a government shutdown and funds the government through the remainder of the fiscal year, which ends on September 30th. And now, by bipartisan, I don't mean a few Democrats here and there voted for it. The final tallies on this, 309 to 118 in the House, 79 to 18 in the Senate. And now, while this legislation did increase military spending, it was only by $19.9 billion, which is far less than President Trump wanted. It also increased funding for the National Institutes of Health by $2 billion, and that's an agency President Trump wanted to cut funding for. In addition, it doesn't provide funds to start work on that big, beautiful border wall the president loved to talk about on the campaign trail. So, Jay, what do you make of all these Republicans and Democrats coming together on the budget and not exactly giving the president what he wanted?
Well, I think it's what we sort of predicted. In many cases, a lot of conservatives are a little depressed here, feeling that Republicans got rolled here. There's not any significant changes to spending. Doesn't really, look at entitlements, all the big pieces that Republicans are concerned about. And again, Trump started off with sort of the very big bluster of here's all the things he's going to cut, and we talked about that at length, and we both said, look, that's just not going to happen, and it didn't. So, in the one hand, look, I'm a little dismayed as a Republican in that I wish they had maybe held the line a little bit stronger and gotten more cuts. And, and the other thing, when we talk about cuts in government spending, often what we're talking about is just decreases in increases. If you look at how many times the government has actually cut or reduced in size over the last couple of decades, you'll find very few examples. That said, I think it made sense as a tactical move for both Republicans and Trump, because there's one sort of cardinal rule that we've learned over the last 2.5 decades, is that Republicans always lose in a government shutdown, no matter what. If the Republicans control the presidency and Congress is controlled by Democrats and they shut it down, Republicans lose. If Republicans control the Congress, they lose. It's sort of emerged as Republicans, there was no good government shutdown. So from a tactical standpoint, I think they made the right choice. Again, I would like to have seen a perhaps stronger bill, but you're at the same time, they're getting a lot of these entitlement changes in the American Health Care Act, which we just talked about. So maybe it's something of a trade-off, in that maybe they're playing the longer game. So.
Yeah. Well, this has definitely been seen as a huge win for the Democrats. I should point out that in the House, 103 of the 118 no votes came from Republicans. In other words, 44% of House Republicans who voted on the bill voted against it. Again, this is a Republican House. And in the Senate, all 18 no votes came from Republicans. And, I was thinking about this a lot this week, and it seemed to me that I came up with 4 basic reasons why so many Republicans opposed it. I'd like to get your thoughts on these. Number one is the sustainability argument, that idea that we're on a path of government spending that's simply unsustainable in the long term, and this didn't cut enough stuff.
Yep. No, I agree. That's okay. That's pretty much the simplest and probably most accurate way to put it.
Well, second is the liberty argument, and that's that this whole idea of this large administrative state growing day by day, controlling more of people's lives, taxing them, mandating their behavior. That's a problem just for that fundamental value of liberty, right?
Right.
And
that sort of precedes the tactical, we want to cut stuff. Why? Because it encroaches on liberty, and if you cut spending, you cut taxes, you sort of starve the beast, as it were. Right,
exactly, yeah. And third is what I call the dependence argument, is that, no, we really do care about poor people, but we just don't want them to become dependent on government benefits. It reminds me of this week, Ben Carson toured some public housing facilities. He's our Secretary of Housing and Urban Development there. And he said, I'm worried that we're going to make these places too nice and people won't want to leave. And I thought, well, I don't think that's going to be a problem. But anyway, that's the dependence argument. And, a lot of conservatives make that.
as I think it was Ronald Reagan once said, that we ought to measure our compassion not by people, how many people are on the welfare rolls, but on how many people no longer need it.
Right.
So, yeah,
and
I agree with you there.
And then finally, is there the efficiency argument, that idea that if government's doing stuff, that means markets aren't doing it, and the best thing for government to do is to pull back and let governments work their magic with minimal government interference. So, to me, that kind of
I'd add maybe a little bit of a gloss to that, in that efficiency, to the extent government needs to be involved, often it can be accomplished better and more efficiently, and with more safeguards to liberty at the state level.
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to bring these things up because I think it's important to point out that most Republicans don't hate poor people. You don't hate poor people, Jay. I know that.
Oh, I like them. I like them quite a bit.
And the thing is what I'm saying is that I certainly share some concerns about the sustainability argument in particular. And I think all of these, to an extent, are valid concerns, though as a liberal, I don't see them to be nearly as valid or nearly as large of concerns as taking care of people and providing a safety net so people can go out and do things and start businesses and innovate and live fulfilling lives and so forth. And I see these things as a little more important. But my point is when I see stories, especially from some of my friends on the left about this, it kind of casts Republicans as these sort of evil villains. And I just, for the most part, there are some people like that, but for the most part, I just don't see that as the case. I just see as kind of a fundamental difference about weighing these concerns that I think we should all, to a certain extent, have, So
sure. No. And I appreciate that. You don't think I'm out there, just, kicking poor people in the street and so forth. But anyway, it does come down to the question of motivation, and often the other side just not understanding one another. You saw this in the ACA also, that, the idea that Republicans are passing these changes, because they want people to die.
Sure.
I mean, again, that's not terribly good politics, no matter where you come from philosophically. But the idea that, and I'll sum it up this way, is that Republicans very much believe that people can make their own individual choices and ought to make their own individual choices. And if they have more money in their own pocket to make their own individual choices, that's sort of a better world than sending that money to Washington to have someone else make those choices who might not make them as wisely, as efficiently, or just come back to the fundamental point of, hey, it's their money. So I appreciate that. Again, some on the left can understand that there's a valid counter argument, and that the idea that private money is somehow bad is sort of nonsensical. So.
No, yeah, and I think it's just a question of weighting, and certainly reasonable people can weight these things in different ways. But again, for me, just saying that, well, I believe that most Republicans have very good intentions doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about what I feel will be disastrous results from these good intentioned efforts.
The ACAJ will still be horrible.
Yes, exactly. And I think, when we talk about debt, and that's one thing that comes up a lot among a lot of people on the right, and it does seem like, for instance, federal spending is growing and the debt is growing. But if you take a look at public debt as a percentage of gross domestic product, which is really the best way to measure it, essentially, because debt is only meaningful in the sense of your ability to repay. It really is not nearly as scary as some of those charts that you see, and it's not growing at the sort of rate that a lot of people paint it as. Same thing with federal spending. I mean, here's one way a lot of people will look at it. Say, well, 20 years ago, the federal government spent around $1.5 trillion. This year, it's more than double that, almost $4 trillion. But as a percentage of GDP, federal spending has actually declined through much of the Obama presidency, and it's really right now at a level that's roughly equivalent to where it's been for the last 40 years. So some of these arguments are based on kind of cherry picking and sort of manipulating statistics, basically, in a way to kind of prove an ideological point. And I should also point out that, you can kind of blame, in a way, if you're concerned about federal spending, you can kind of blame, or deficits, you can blame Ronald Reagan, the patron saint of the right, about whom no bad word may be uttered, right? Because he issued in this era of big tax cuts with no cuts in spending. In fact, increases in spending. And when you take a look at all these debt charts, they start to just go way up starting in right around 1980. And that's a lot to do with the Republicans kind of abandoning, well, not abandoning their idea of cutting taxes, certainly, but abandoning their idea of kind of having offsetting spending cuts with tax cuts, which has a lot of conservatives upset.
Let's also remember, though, that when Reagan took office, he faced a Democratic House, and then for part of his presidency, a Democratic House and Democratic Senate, which controls the spending. So on the one hand, I mean, tax cuts are always popular. Spending cuts rarely are. But I think the other piece to look at, though, if you compare that Reagan era chart of GDP versus debt, is also the increasing interest on the debt that we're paying. Now, we've been pretty fortunate to the extent we did a lot of borrowing early in the Obama administration. We had a $1 trillion debt spending. Interest rates were relatively low. So I suppose it could have been worse. But if you look at the gradual piece of the federal pie that is always paying interest, that's the problem. And we conservatives have been concerned for years that there's going to be a debt bomb essentially waiting down the road that's going to happen, and it's starting to happen with baby boomer retirements where they're qualifying for more and more federal programs.
Sure.
And not having that same level of economic activity to support that. And that's just a demographic thing, that you have more people then taking money out of the system than we're putting into it.
And no, I think that's a really important point.
And I'll say the way out of it, and the way out that Reagan proposed and most conservatives propose is growth. It's increasing that GDP piece of it, so that ratio narrows and eventually the debt is more manageable too.
Yeah, I think no one is really, well, there are some people who are against growth. That's a whole nother episode perhaps, but and I think the other thing you bring up is where the money goes, right? And about 2/3 of all federal spending goes to what's called mandatory spending, and that's spending that's authorized by previous legislation, which means that if you want to change that, Congress has to pass a new law and the president has to sign it. And that's really tough to do. And the lion's share of that are those entitlement programs you mentioned, like Social Security and Medicare and other health programs. Those are really tough to change, especially.
Yeah, so I saw.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I saw one commentator note, and I forget who, but that in many ways we are a giant insurance company with an army.
Yeah. And, that's the other thing I wanted to bring up in a minute here. But, because the 1/3 of discretionary spending, that means that needs to be reauthorized with every budget. Well, military spending is 53% of that. And that dwarfs everything else. In fact, the United States military spending is right around 40% or so of the entire world's military spending. I mean, being the superpower to the extent we are militarily is hugely expensive. And there were some people who thought that, well, maybe President Trump, based on some of his campaign rhetoric, would be interested in pulling back on some of that, but clearly that's not the case. He asked for an awfully big increase in the military. And so the thing is, if you want to take care of this, if you want to cut some of these things, these are difficult things to cut. And no one really wants to vote for a cut in military spending. No one wants to vote for Social Security and Medicare spending because old people vote like crazy, and so these are tough things to do. And I see a real lack of nerve. But the thing is, you point out what the interest payments, someone is going to pay for this, and it's going to be your kids, Jay. It's going to be people in the future because these bills will come due.
Yeah. And we referenced the, oh my gosh, and I'm blanking on the two members of the commission that President Obama put together that came out with recommendations, and
right.
I'm horribly embarrassed. Give me a second.
No, I'm blanking on them too, so that's fine. But that commission that President Obama put together, yes, go ahead.
Hold on. But the idea they were unable to come up with a definite proposal for debt reduction. But what they did come up with was sort of a framework. wherein tax cuts, spending increases, spending cuts were all scored, and there was sort of a give and take, and the idea would be, listen, if Congress wants to move forward, here are the trade-offs that you'll have to make. You want to have this much in tax cuts, you can have this much in the Simpson-Bowles Commission.
There you go. Okay.
How can I forget? Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming and former Chief of Staff Erskine Bowles. I believe he was a Chief of Staff. He was a lot of things. But that report and that way of thinking, I mean, really hasn't gone anywhere. Again, they began meeting early in Obama's first term and put out the report, I want to say in 2014, maybe 2012. And it's still out there. But if for those who are interested, I mean, I look up Simpson-Bowles, and it's really a fascinating view of where our country's finances are and how you get there. Now, I disagree with to some extent that tax cuts are always a deficit or always a debit, because there is some increase in activity that tax cuts breeds that ends up bringing more money in the coffers. But that's if you want to understand government finance, that's a good place to look.
Yeah. I'll disagree with you. Well, I won't disagree with you entirely on that last point. Certainly,
you don't like Simpson-Bowles? Come on, man.
No. On the idea that tax cuts can pay for themselves, I think that's fairly discredited. Though I will say that it is fair to take into account that certain tax cuts in certain instances do create economic growth that is a important to take into account when you're estimating costs and benefits. So, all right, Jay, we're introducing a new feature to the show this week. It's called What We're Reading. What We're Reading, where we'll talk about some in-depth, long read, article, book, podcast, episode, documentary, whatever that we've come across during the week. So I guess we could call it what we're reading, listening to, or watching, but that doesn't really sound so good. So let's just stick with what we're reading. And the reason we're planning to make this a regular feature on the show is that it's so easy to get completely caught up in short news stories and that kind of near instant analysis of what's happening right now. But if that's all the media we consume, we're left with this shallow, superficial view of the world that I think impoverishes our understanding of it, and in the end makes us poorer citizens and less capable of competent self-government. So our hope, our hope is that you'll check out some of our recommendations, and we'll be putting links to them on our website, and that you'll find them useful in deepening your understanding of politics and society. But we're doing this for ourselves as well, so that we end up more consistently seeking out this sort of in-depth and thoughtful analysis that we hope will make us better at our jobs as politics podcasters. So with that, if you don't mind, Jay, I'll inaugurate it with my top read of the week.
All right. What are you reading, Mike?
Well, it's an article by Andrew Sullivan called Reactionaries Must Be Taken Seriously in the latest issue of New York Magazine. Now, Sullivan's not exactly a conservative, not really a liberal, but he's been one of my favorite political writers for a long time. And in this article, he discusses the differences between conservatives and reactionaries. And he basically argues that while both have a certain respect or really even reverence for the past, conservatives are skeptical of big radical changes, whereas reactionaries are all about big radical changes. And he argues that, most of what we see in the so-called conservative movement these days are really kind of reactionaries more than conservatives. And then he goes on to discuss some of the leading reactionary academics, bloggers, other thought leaders, these folks who came out and supported Donald Trump. And he explains where they think the country went wrong and why Trump, for all of his flaws, might be the last best hope of getting the United States back on the right track. And I really found this to be the most reasonable and fair-minded account of what some have termed the alt-right that I've seen so far, and I've read a lot on this. And so I highly recommend it, especially to my friends on the left. And if you do read it, I'd love to hear what you think about it. So there we go.
Okay, that's a good one.
All right.
So, well, my my pick was a op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal from April 21st by Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse, entitled "The Challenge of Our Disruptive Era." And it's interesting in that it's unusual that you see a sitting political figure sort of take big picture arguments and talk about where we stand in the bigger scope of history. It's all too typical that they say, whatever legislation, X House bill, whatever, is vital to the future of mankind, and if it isn't passed, or if this is passed, we're on the brink of catastrophe. And he sort of starts by saying, look, this is in very ways silly, and historians are right to point out that often the things the media focuses on as this is tremendous, this is huge, life-changing, really isn't when you look at it in the grand scope of history. But then he proceeds to take a look at the grand scope of history and say, we are, in fact, living in a time when we're moving from a fundamentally different economy, or from a fundamentally, certain said norms in an economy into a new one. Now, that's not entirely a new idea, but if you really start to think about the transitions from a hunter-gatherer economy to an agricultural one, from an agricultural one to an industrial one, and then industrial to a post-industrial, which is sort of where we are on the brink. It's really, it is a little daunting that we may be at one of these sort of pivots in human history, and how it affects not just the economy of what kind of work people do, but their expectations, how they live their lives, how they govern themselves, how they talk to one another. So I'd recommend that. Again, it hits on a lot of other things going on. Sort of points to maybe some pieces of the Trump phenomenon. But I found it really, again, an interesting read from unusual from a sitting politician who aren't typically public and elected. The last one I can think is like a Daniel Patrick Moynihan who looked at these kind of big picture things. So
right now, we'll also post. I read that article as well, and I thought it was really good. I agree with you entirely. Worth checking out. We'll post a link to that as well. Though I should point out that the Wall Street Journal, because they hate the little people. They make you pay for most of this stuff, so this may be behind their paywall. But if you have the opportunity or have a subscription or know someone who does, it certainly is worth checking out, because that, as Jay pointed out, that is a really good article. A lot of good stuff in there. All right, that's it for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. We really appreciate our great listeners who have generously supported the show through their donations. And if you'd like to join them, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website, politicsguys.com. And if money's tight or you're already a financial supporter, please consider hitting that share icon on your podcast app to pass this episode along to your friends and followers. And also leaving ratings and reviews of the show on your app.
Don't cost nothing.
But no, that's right. Exactly. Totally free. And so that really helps spread the word. That helps bring in new listeners. That leads to the donations and advertisers that make us possible for us to keep on bringing you the show. And finally, thanks to today's sponsor, proflowers.com, where you can get the 100 Blooms for Mom bouquet and a free glass vase starting at $19.99 plus shipping and handling by going to proflowers.com, clicking on the microphone in the top right corner, and using our code, TPG. That's proflowers.com and code TPG when you click on the mic. We'll be back with a new show next Sunday. We hope you'll join us.